We encourage you to check out the ITPS.org for those recordings, as well as other exciting projects like the ITPS podcast, hosted by Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky, Rev 250 related projects, and other DH and data science work, which will all be available through that portal within the next week. The ITPS has been involved over the past year in conversations and planning for how to approach the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution here in New York. From an event last year to a special issue with New York History Journal to collaborations with wonderful groups and partners around the state, we've been listening, learning, and considering how best to engage with the complex anniversary of 2026. With this in mind, as many historians have argued, it seemed important to also consider the years before 1776 as a foundation in both positive, negative, and all kinds of complicated ways for what would come next, in order to more fully understand that legacy of revolution that we're still confronting today. Considering the framing of independence in light of the 250th anniversary of the Boston Massacre and its place in a vast protest movement, a recurring point in our conversation over the last few days has been independence for whom? Who desired to separate from the British Empire and why, and what strategies of protest were they willing to use, and who would ultimately be ignored and harmed by independence, Indigenous and enslaved people in particular. In an absolutely arresting chapter, A Deadly Riot, March 1770, Dr. Zabin writes of a, quote, slow estrangement that transformed neighbors into strangers. She describes a shooting that would, quote, change everything, only not right away. While conflicts between townspeople and soldiers did not lead inevitably to the Boston Massacre, she writes, the shooting would come to redefine those conflicts in new and harsher terms. And as discussed in last night's plenary, and again in this morning's roundtable on teaching about protest, the imagery surrounding protest and the terms in which it is communicated is critical to our understanding, yet again, as we approach these framings. And with that, I have a new word for you. I'm thrilled to introduce the terrific Dr. Serena Zabin. I cannot thank Dr. Zabin enough for her patience and flexibility as this conference moved online, and how excited I am to learn from her keynote today.
Thank you so much, Nora. Thank you for having me. And I think maybe I'll start right now with also thanking all of you in advance for your patience as we move through this digital format. I will do my best with it, but I'm so honored and pleased to be the person who gets to give the final address of really what was a fabulous conference. I'm so pleased to be here with you all. So thank you. It's been fabulous. I've learned so much. So I know that we've all been talking about Revolution 250, and yet somehow I entitled this talk 3 Centuries of the Boston Massacre. I get that 250 years isn't quite 300. My quantitative reasoning is weak, but not that bad. But I want to talk tonight about both the Boston Massacre 250 years ago and about it some years into the future. So in other words, I'm going to be talking tonight about both my book and my computer game. We might call that the codex and the game controller, something like that. So I'm going to do, just looking at the list of people who are here, I'm going to do some pretty geeky methodological comments here because I think this is an audience of lots of people who might like that. And especially I want to talk about how looking again at an old story that we think has nothing left to tell us can actually lead us to some unexpected places. So just a little scene setting for those of you who, unlike Nora, didn't just read my book. So just a reminder, right? We start in March of 1770 in Boston, this little corner, 16,000 people, if that, a square mile on the very edge of North America, practically falling into the sea, looking primarily, honestly, towards, in most ways, looking towards Britain, and a town that has, and still a town then, not a city, a town that has in it a mess of soldiers, something, around on the lines of about 1,000 soldiers and some other folks who came with them. I'll talk about that. And one of them that night is standing sentry in front of the custom house. As I'm sure you all know, we don't know much about what actually really happened that night. We know that some people walked by. There was some conversation. Maybe there was some snow. It certainly had just snowed. We know the sentry gets anxious and calls for backup. That we feel pretty confident about. And when the backup comes, it's a handful of soldiers. And I'm sorry, just looking at the comments there. Sorry, there's a handful of soldiers that come, and we actually don't really completely know what happened after that. We know more and more people come in the street, somewhere between 30 and 250, which is a big range. And we know at some point someone yells, fire, someone fires, and when the smoke clears, we know that there are 5 people bleeding in the snow, some of them dead. And that's about as much as we know. That's kind of the story, though. Even that basic bit is the story that we have to unlearn. So most Americans, and here I'm going to start, I hope, sharing my screen, which I trust will actually look like a PowerPoint in just a moment. So here we are. So we know vaguely, most Americans at least, about this event largely because of this picture, right? So yesterday, Nan Wolverton, I think I saw her name in the list, which is excellent, told us about this Revere exhibit that showed just how pervasive this image was, right? So let's take a look at it. We see hapless Bostonians who are being mowed down by a phalanx of disciplined soldiers urged on by their captain, right? We see lots of gore, not surprisingly. That one woman with her hands to her breast, right? Right in the center. And that woman, as I expect most of you remember, is a little hint to the viewer, right? That she's surrounded by a group of, respectable Bostonians, not a mob of hooligans. And then, of course, we have the dog, who I hope will show up again later, but, that symbol of loyalty here looking very lost. And, we all teach this piece, or those of us who are in the classroom, but even, who aren't, as, an obvious piece of bias, right? It's not hard to see. We might, start with, Butcher's Hall, but there are other bits as well. But the problem is, I think we've been so distracted by the obvious bias that we missed the more subtle one, okay? Because it's so obvious, actually, we don't see it anymore. And this is what I might call the story of the 2 sides. Because if you look, the very center of this image is this thick white line of gun smoke. And visually, this line separates the row of disciplined red-coated soldiers from that crowd of terrified civilians that they're slaughtering. And the smoke marks for Revere and his viewers, soldiers on one side, right, and inhabitants on the other. And even though we all know as historians that there were not neat divisions into Tories and Patriots, certainly not in 1770, and really not ever, and we know that well, we don't seem to be able to get that story across. Okay? We know the truth of the matter is civilians and soldiers were not on the opposite side of the street, neither actually figuratively nor actually. And so what I found as I worked on this project is that once we stop letting Revere tell us what we could see here, right? Once we stop letting him show us just a single block, there's a whole different story of Boston that's just lying there in plain sight. But to get to this whole different story, I actually needed to start somewhere else. And I found that the beginning of the story, if any story can have a beginning, was to be found as a young Irish woman followed her husband onto a troop ship in 1765, carrying a baby. The trail to this woman started in the most surprising place, actually the Special Collections room at Carleton College, because there I came across a mention of a soldier's wife talking to Bostonians just a few days before that March 5th shooting. And that famous pamphlet that we'll look at later that I expect you all know, the short narrative, that's published just a few weeks after the shooting. So it's not an obscure document. It's excerpted in most textbooks. I myself have been teaching it for years, but actually it took a while before I realized that it's full of references to soldiers' wives. And even then, it took a while before I realized that I didn't know anything about these women, or actually, honestly, I didn't even know that soldiers could be married, right? It just never made any sense to me. So then I started to wonder, who were these soldiers' wives? Why were they in Bostonians' homes? And then a few months later, I went to Boston, and my very first morning in the archives, I found about 3 marriages between soldiers and civilians in these Boston church records. And I thought, okay, this is a story. What in the world was happening with all of these women, both traveling with soldiers and marrying them? And that was a story that brought me right into the heart of the administration of the British Empire. So when that Irish woman and her husband boarded that troop ship in Ireland, they were part of a peacetime deployment. And I know that most of you know this part, but I think the context matters. So just bear with me as I skip merrily through the towns and acts here. Okay. So 2 years earlier, right, Britain had won the 7 Years' War. And what matters for us in that moment, although there are many, of course, important implications, but what really matters is that while the French maybe, withdrew their claims to Eastern North America, their native allies, unsurprisingly, did not cede their land. And so now the British Crown had to figure out how they were going to manage their new empire. And of course, the story that most of us do know, how they were going to pay for the war. Right? And so one of the things that they decide they need to do is actually pay for these troops with money that isn't going to come directly out of the British Parliament. Not actually for those reasons that we often think of, which is because they thought that colonists should bear the brunt of their own protection, which is actually a thing that they sometimes even said. So maybe it's not surprising that historians were misled by those comments, but actually because of another factoid that I know you all know, right? Which was the cultural opposition to a standing army in wartime, right? So the British people were really hoping when the 7 Years' War was over that there was going to be a peace dividend, right? That they were going to stop paying for such an enormous army. And in fact, the standing army that Britain had really since the 17th century was primarily hidden in Ireland. They put most of it in Ireland, and they forced the Irish Parliament to pay for it. And they thought, well, we'll do the same thing in North America, right? The money for it isn't going to come directly out of the British Parliament. Instead, we're going to feed it right back into the army through the colonial governments. So they decide they're going to, put together these custom duties and other things. There are riots, as you all know well, against both the custom duties and the people who are supposed to collect them. And so in 1768, after a particularly enormous protest, the Massachusetts governor decided that he needed some backup. He was getting anxious, and he thought maybe troops would help him keep order in Boston. Okay, so let's think about what we know about the British Army. We know, as I said, the whole idea that there should be an army in peacetime seemed wrong to most Britons, right? We know that Britain did have a peacetime force, but everyone was very, very clear that it was subject to civilian authority, okay? And so then that brings me to my second point, which is that governors and magistrates often ask the War Office to send them troops to use as a police force. And this was as true in England as it was in the colonies, right? So all over England, smugglers tried to evade import taxes, and local magistrates tried to catch them at it. And in fact, that same year that the governor of Massachusetts asked for troops in 1768, the man who's in charge of distributing regiments around the British Empire, the quartermaster general, complained that so many magistrates had asked for troops to support customs officials and to suppress riots all over Boston that he was running out of troops to hand out. So actually, I'll just stop sharing for a moment, sorry. So we're done talking about him for a bit, talking about Revere. So he's running out of troops. No one's singling out Boston at this particular moment, but we should note that not only does the governor act just like any other magistrates, but that we need to open up our understanding a little bit of that 18th century British Army, because we often think of 18th century armies as parallel to contemporary ones and everything but equipment. But in fact, and here, sorry, I probably should show you some pictures again. Sorry, in fact, they looked quite, I hope, sorry, because 18th century armies traveled with women and children, as you can see in this 18th century watercolor. They were complete family institutions. Hundreds of military families flooded into Boston in 1768, and their presence in the town ends up having an immense impact on future events. Okay, so the governor of Massachusetts said he needed troops to support the work he's doing for the British government. The War Office says, sure, whatever. And the War Office was used to using troops to put down riots and shut down smuggling. So when those first two regiments come sailing into Boston Harbor, here we have Revere again, in the fall of 1768, the governor and the council, and you probably all remember this piece too, right? We're still squabbling over where the troops should be quartered. So if we think about why this is a problem, let's look at Boston, okay? So this is what it looked like in 1769. 1769 map, here it is sort of stretched over a modern map, and you can see how much of that 18th century harbor has been filled in with the Back Bay. But the size of Boston matters here because of that fight about where soldiers are going to end up. Selectmen wanted them in these refurbished barracks out on Castle Island that they had refurbished with Massachusetts tax money for the 7 Years' War. Okay, and meanwhile, the governor and the commanding officer wanted them right in the heart of Boston. Okay, and so you can see this is what the harbor looked like, right? That it's out in the middle of, of what has become, sorry, this is what the fort looks like. Castle Williams, now Castle Island, right in the middle of the harbor. And the problem, and John McCurdy's done a great job explaining this to us, is that the 18th century Quartering Act was really clear that soldiers had to be housed first in existing barracks. If there were no barracks, then regiments went to public houses. Only if there were no barracks and no public houses could soldiers be put into private houses. Okay, very clear. And Boston had these barracks right there on Castle Island. Quite nice, right? The problem is they were about 4 miles away from the center of Boston. And this then put the governor and the commanding officers in a quandary. They wanted the troops to be right here in the middle of Boston. They wanted to use this private property in the center of Boston. That was going to be the only way they could put them up there. But the selectmen warned them that the officers would be cashiered for violating the Quartering Act if they tried to take private property. So they end up with this compromise, okay, that the Army would not requisition private property. Instead, they would pay for it. So it took a little while to uncover this part of the story. All that bickering about where soldiers are going to live, it's all right there in the town records. But most historians have looked at it and used it to chortle at the hypocrisy of a few Sons of Liberty who bent their convictions so much that they rented houses to the British Army just to make a buck. But that, I realized, was really the wrong way to look at this. Instead, I wondered, what was the impact on Bostonians and military families of this compromise? What was the impact of the compromise? Because first, the Army did rent all of the available warehouses that are in the center of Boston. And those are these blue dots here, or blue squares, excuse me. And that simply wasn't enough. So the Army ended up having to hire private houses, rooms in private houses, even outbuildings to house the overflow. And so as a result, the troops and the townspeople found themselves living literally together. They turned Bostonians into landlords. So This map with all these red dots shows us pretty clearly how completely soldiers' families moved into the streets of Boston. Far from being isolated in that small circle right in the center of Boston, like a kind of green zone, right? Soldiers and their families lived in the rooms and yards of Bostonians in every area of town. And when 2,000 members of the army, so there end up being 4 regiments at about 500 guys apiece, when 2,000 members of an army move into a town that's only about 16,000 people, they sometimes found each other a little annoying. And that explains, I think, something about the image that we get from Revere. Because to Sons of Liberty, like Revere or other political groups, they saw the presence of troops as a military occupation. So the clerk of the town meeting complained to a correspondent that Boston has become a garrison town. He and the other men walking through Boston at night were really annoyed that the soldiers, that they got stopped, that they were stopped in the street by soldiers who were on patrol. And meanwhile, the constables who made up the Boston Watch found themselves the brunt of some pretty abusive language from drunken officers. But their complaints are really not the only way to think about troops in Boston. So instead, I'd like to suggest that we think of a very different place when we think about the term garrison town. So instead, take a moment to call Meryton in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice to mind. Think of the excitement that having a regiment quartered a few miles away created for that family at Longbourn. Fathers might be anxious, but young women were delighted. So think of Lydia Bennet, right? Imagining herself at a regimental encampment. And here I'm just going to quote a little Austen because she's so awesome. She saw, so this is Austen talking of Lydia, she saw all the glories of the camp, its tents stretched forth in beauteous uniformity of lines, crowded with the young and the gay, and dazzling with scarlet. And to complete the view, she saw herself seated beneath a tent, tenderly flirting with at least 6 officers at once. The soldiers that beguiled the young women of Meryton during the Napoleonic Wars were not so different from those red-coated men who caught the eye of Boston's young women in the years before the American Revolution. The arrival of regiments in Boston in 1768 was just as exciting to those local women. So let's use Pride and Prejudice to help us understand what it meant to families and neighborhoods when there was a regiment quartered nearby. Because the arrival of nearly 2,000 men, many of them young and single, and all of them with a steady, if small income, could not help but attract the attention of young women. With so many young men frequenting taverns, strolling the streets, dropping by a neighbor's kitchen, an unmarried woman might well be able to find a husband, possibly one even living in her family's spare room. I mean, who knew that doing laundry could be so fun? And like Lydia's father, Mr. Bennet, some men found it impossible to control their female dependents in the face of so many redcoats. And so here, I hope that not too many of you know the story, but I have to tell one of my favorite stories from all of my research, because I do think it will give a little flavor of what it was like to live in Boston in those years. Okay? So coming into his daughter's house one day in June of 1769, Joseph Lazenby, who's a 75-year-old son of liberty, was shocked to find Private William Clark in bed with his 20-year-old granddaughter, Mary Nowell. He ordered Clark out of the house, but the insouciant officer refused to leave. Clark told the horrified old man that he had every right to be in bed with Mary because she was his wife. So Clark had stretched the truth a bit, because the story that Mary later told her sister was that they had been married one evening by a person who was dressed as a priest. And in fact, they weren't married until 4 months after being caught in bed. That news came pretty close to killing Mary's parents, but not nearly as close as Clark did, because 2 weeks later, Mary's father had an altercation with a soldier who shoved a loaded pistol into Joseph Nowell's chest. Nowell pressed charges, and he got Clark in prison for 3 months. But that private knew how to take his revenge. The following summer, he advertised the sale of his tell-all memoir, which he entitled, but he entitled A True and Faithful Narrative of the Love Intrigues of the author, William Clark, soldier in His Majesty's 29th Regiment of Foot, in which is given a faithful account of his courtship marriage, and bedding with Mary Nowell, daughter of Joseph Nowell, boat builder at North End Boston, with a description of how much he suffered on said account. So he was doing the entire thing, address and all. But of course, it's worth noting that Clark didn't just sleep with Nowell, he married her. And as you may remember from Pride and Prejudice, sleeping with a soldier didn't necessarily lead to marriage. So, it's no surprise to know that local women had sex with soldiers in 18th century Boston, and the court and almshouse records preserve lots of evidence of the children born from those encounters. More surprising, of course, is that some of those local women married soldiers. And here I'm actually speaking of both privates and officers. Okay, so the town records indicate what I found in the end was about 40 registered marriages between Massachusetts women and regular soldiers. And I actually think that this is a pretty significant undercount from some of the other stories that I found later. So many of the children are born a good 9 months after their marriage. Most of them are baptized in local churches. We know over 100 baptisms from these military families between the ages of the years of 1768 to 72. And those baptism records preserve the connections that are radiating outwards from the nuclear family that parents made for their children. Okay? So local families acted as godparents for their children, for the children born of those new relationships. Okay? And maybe even that the records reveal these links between civilians and soldiers, and I think possibly even more than sex or marriage, acting as a godparent, as a civilian, to the child of a soldier allowed local women and men to make public their ties to that military community. And here, I don't want to really untangle too much those links of godparents because it ends up sounding like reading the phone book. It doesn't go over well. But you should envision, right, this vast network of people that tied together soldiers and Boston men, military women, and local women. Those Boston streets were a web of interconnection. Sorry, sorry. I hope we'll go back to these guys. They were a web of interconnections between, well, we'll look at some of these. These are some of our marriages. Between local and local people and civilians, okay? They're scattered throughout the town. Soldiers had become both neighbors and family for many Bostonians. And despite the annoyances that some of these newcomers brought, from raucous parties to these rakish seductions, they had become part of Bostonians' lives and sometimes families. They watched each other's children. They borrowed household necessities from each other. And this is not to say that soldiers had completely lost their identification with the British Empire, far from it. But even as they continued to represent the power of the British Empire, they ceased to be strangers, okay? And that's the piece that Nora pulled out and quoted for us. So we can see from this evidence, so here just, and I'm actually gonna slide back a little bit, I'm sorry about this PowerPoint, but we can see all of the evidence of how widespread their physical connections are around the town of Boston. We understand from this and from lots of other evidence that soldiers and civilians were much more closely entwined than we realized. Okay, so just because, of course, they knew each other doesn't mean they liked each other. And so therefore, when that lone sentry in the center of town on King Street grew anxious at being hassled by some crowd of Bostonians, and he called for backup. And that backup that came, that handful of soldiers that were led by the captain of the day, Thomas Preston, they all knew at least some of the Bostonians in the street that night. Okay, so one of them was James Hartigan, and I'm sorry, I think we lost this picture, sorry, who had just married. We can see where he lived, if I can find you, there we are. So he had just married, living there in that blue dot, a woman named Elizabeth Henderson a few months earlier. Another one was a man named Edward Montgomery, whose Irish wife, Isabella, had come to Boston with him 17 months earlier. And, earlier that night, apparently, Montgomery had shouted loudly enough for people in the surrounding houses to hear that the town was too haughty and too proud, and many of their asses would be laid low by morning. And the Bostonian Susanna Cathcart, tired of both Isabella and her husband, shot back, "I hope your husband will be killed." But not all the people in the street that night actually wished death on the Montgomerys, okay? Because also in the street was a carpenter named Thomas Wilkinson. And for a few months, the Montgomerys had rented a house near Wilkinson, and they'd become friendly. And in that 18th century equivalent of, borrowing a cup of sugar from your neighbor, Wilkinson occasionally sent his children to the Montgomerys' house for coals to start his own fire. So when Wilkinson saw Montgomery marching out to support the sentry, he walked straight over to ask his former neighbor what was happening. Of course, what was happening that night is the big question, right? We don't know much. We know that these 5 people are dead or dying. And at the time, after that shooting, the event was shocking. Everyone was horrified to see Bostonians bleeding out in the snow in front of the seat of governmental power. Okay, I mean, I think we do have to imagine it's like watching protesters in the heart of Washington, D.C. being shot with tear gas. Okay, it's not that dissimilar. But, and this is a big but, it may be worth our thinking about. Absolutely no one thought that this was the beginning of a revolution, right? Boston women continued to marry British soldiers. Half of those marriages I found happened after March 5th, 1770. John Adams, of course, agreed to take on the defense of the soldiers and the captain, and 2 juries of Massachusetts men acquitted most of the soldiers. And maybe it's a big risk to say that at this conference, but I have to say, I don't think the shooting on the night of March 5th was much of an act of protest. It's only when that shooting became transformed into the Boston Massacre that political meaning, political protest started to cling to that event. Both those people who supported the governor and those who opposed him scrambled to tell their version of the story. Both wanted to claim innocence, of course, and put their blame on the other side. And they did this through pamphlets. And those were those pamphlets that I was going to try to show you there. Oops, sorry, I'm too now. Here we are. These 2 pamphlets, right? Full of all this evidence about families, through images, and most of all through the trial of the soldiers and the captain. So what is the result of turning this event into a political protest that comes to be known as the Boston Massacre? Actually, the effect of it, the impact, is that it erased women and children and neighbors from the story. We already have seen that happen with Revere. We see it in the trials, which deliberately ignored any connection between civilians and soldiers. And both sides found it necessary to ignore the family history of the Boston Massacre. So after the shooting, the troops are redeployed, and we have to ask what happens to those families when they're ripped apart, right? So it's because they now have these roots in Boston, and people are faced with choices. Men can stay, right, and sort of desert, right? Women could stay and self-divorce from their soldier husbands, or women could go with the army as little shards of Boston, right, embedded in the British Army. And that ripping apart of families, I think, is actually the most significant impact of the shooting that night. So this story, okay, all of it really was just sitting around in the records, waiting for someone to pick it up, okay? It took some digging, it took some organization, but it really spoke to the empiricist in me, right? There was a lot of evidence here. And yet, it's really hard to bring this story to a wider public, okay? And so I've been thinking not just as a way of replacing a book, although, readership is hard to find, but really bringing people to see and live some of this evidence a little bit differently. So as Lauren Duvall pointed out yesterday, we have learned a lot about gender in the revolution, but how can we make it come to life? How can we still talk about protest, but not as if the only people who mattered in that story, and this is part of what came up today in the roundtable on gender that I also attended, we don't want to talk about protests as though the only people that matter are the people who died, or the people with guns, right? And so when you put it like that, actually, that, you know, one is actually looking for ways to minimize the importance of guns and death. Maybe a video game is not necessarily the first place to start, but somehow that is where I have ended up. So I'm gonna stop sharing for a moment here. I didn't start, honestly, with the idea of a video game. I started with a different part of the digital humanities, not surprisingly, mapping, as you can see from this project. And as we worked on that map, as I worked on it with some students, I had hoped that I could connect the marriages and baptisms that I found in one part of the record to the places that we knew people lived. But it turns out that data didn't overlap, right? And so then I started wondering about how different kinds of people experience the streets of Boston. And I especially started to wonder about how those women who so completely disappeared from the story of the Boston Massacre could be actually put back, right? Put back in our vision. And so I began with a man and a woman, the Cole borrowing Thomas Wilkinson, and a woman named Jane Crothers. And I was particularly interested in Jane because she's the only woman to give testimony at Captain Preston's trial. So she may have been a barmaid in the Royal Exchange Tavern, and certainly that seems to be where she's living. So I will just move us back to maps one more time. You can see here's Jane is in purple, right? She's living very close to a number of other people who have been marrying locals. She gives evidence that exonerates Captain Preston from giving that order to fire. But she's no disinterested witness. In the months between the shooting and the trial, she's actually married to an Army private. And yet no lawyer wants to point that out. And that was part of their strategy of erasing all that evidence of women and families and neighbors from this story of political protest and state power. Okay, so both she and they're on this plan that Revere created for the trial, probably. You see the red box is the Royal Exchange Tavern where she was probably living, and you can see how close she is actually to the shooting itself. She claims that she's standing where that red dot is. Thomas Wilkinson is practically next to her, if you listen to his testimony. And yet they saw two very different events. And so I started with that problem. And I'm not gonna go through here all the twists and turns of starting to create a computer game with eager but amateur undergraduates. We wanted to get at a problem of epistemology, right? So how is it that we know what we know? And we thought that if players could see that soldiers and civilians had connections with each other, that the later narrative of one side against the other, that Revere picture, wouldn't hold in their minds, right? So now I'm gonna let you all sit back and watch a playthrough of our, I don't know, it's such a thing as a pre-alpha game. It's about 3 minutes long, and it's wonderful and slightly embarrassing, but enjoy about 3 minutes and you can see how it is.
Last night, soldiers under the command of Captain Preston shot into a crowd of people on King Street. The selectman asked me to report everything the witnesses saw after the fire was ringing. He said it might be useful for the trials later. I need to take these people's depositions and report them back to the selectman. State your name and how you came to witness the shooting.
I'm Thomas Wilkins. I followed my former neighbor, the soldier Montgomery, to King Street.
How big was the crowd?
There were 60 or 70 people there.
Where was Captain Preston standing?
I saw Captain Preston standing to the right of the circle.
What was the crowd like?
They came down from the south end with buckets, crying, "Where is the fire?"
Thank you. That will be all. Sounds like a lot of people thought there actually was a fire. State your name and how you came to witness the shooting.
My name is Jane Whitehouse. I'm a barmaid at the Royal Exchange Tavern. I heard a noise and went out to ask my fiance's friend, the sentinel, what was happening.
Where was Captain Preston standing?
The captain stood to the left about 3 yards.
How big was the crowd?
It was a riot. The soldiers barely pushed through.
What was the crowd like?
They threw snowballs, oyster shells, and chunks of wood as they called out, "Fire, damn you! You can't kill us!"
Thank you. That will be all. Her fiancé is friends with the sentinel. She must know the soldiers really well. That's the last one, at least for now. They all say something different. I don't know if we'll ever know what really happened. Anyway, I need to tell the selectmen what I think occurred last night based on what I just heard.
So, yeah, it's a worthy goal, I gotta say, thinking about ambiguity and nuance in a computer game. And yet maybe the game, as my own children informed me quite forcefully, turns out to be not that fun to play. It's kind of cool to look at, but, well, and actually parts of it are weird to look at too. But it's not that fun. And as you can see, it ends up still ending with guns and death, right? Which is precisely where I didn't want to go. So we needed some help. That was quite clear. And actually, we needed people who knew more about video games. And as any of you who are working in the digital humanities know, games, all this stuff are essentially collaborative projects. So we pretty recently found two amazing scholars at the University of Wisconsin-Stout, which has a huge game development program, not that far from Carleton. And it's, and we've been working with them on it. So right now, our kind of new version of this game exists primarily in our minds. I can show you the very vaguest of SketchUps, but this is how we see it working. Oops, sorry. Oh. All right, well, I'm gonna move this to where, okay, so this is how it's supposed to happen. We went back to the cornerstone, what I think of as truly accessible history, right? Which is narrative and storytelling. And so this game has become something that's a lot more like interactive TV, actually. So the game turns out to be a collection of episodes that feature a single historical figure like Wilkinson or Croth or someone like that. And these episodes are then grouped according to a common theme. You know, you play for about 5 minutes, 3 minutes maybe, and each episode has these 4 main parts in which you get an objective. So you have to do something. I think that was maybe the problem with the first one. You get a secondary objective by collecting historical objects. Oopsie, sorry, you say something about, I can look at those in a minute. the Boston, about what you saw, you witness it, and then you somehow see the evidence of the implications of what you said. Okay, so and I'm actually watching time here, but so to go back to our evidence, for example, from our neighbor Thomas Wilkinson, right? So, and I'd said earlier that, you know, he said he walked straight over to ask his neighbor, his former neighbor, that soldier, what happened that night. Or sorry, what was happening? Sorry, as his neighbor was being marched out to support the sentry. But that's not actually what his testimony says. So if you look at the route that he claims he took through the streets of Boston, you can see he ended up looping all over the place as he's trying to get through the crowd and through the building to see his friend. Okay, so you can see all this loop that he's doing. And so then that primary objective for that game becomes a kind of mini maze game, right? So you can see, this is a very pre-SketchUp, but you know, there he is standing actually on Paul Revere's map, trying to figure out how is he going to get around the water pump? How is he going to get to those soldiers to ask his friend what is going on? Okay, and then so now he can only see a part of what's happening. You can also get a few more points in this game then by engaging in the material world of 18th century Boston. So you pick up objects like a tankard or a bullet mold or like a pocketbook like this one, that add nuance to the character's main story, and they might offer some counter evidence, for example, right? Or maybe tell us a little more about them. So here, for example, is a very early sketch of what the Royal Exchange Tavern will look like, right? The site of Jane's story. And she maybe might see that those soldiers as potential marriage material. But finding a poem in a newspaper, going back to Jordan's comment today about how much I love doggerel, right? I think everyone's got to pick up a piece of doggerel. She's going to find a poem in a newspaper that she picks up as she's clearing up that shows the player that there were some Boston men who were pretty upset about Boston women dating redcoats, right? So then we have all of these all these characters. Oh, sorry, then this might be what it would look like as she looks out the door of the Royal Exchange Tavern. She then, stop sharing so we can see you again. So just finishing up on this game here, because we're really talking to, we chose characters for this game who all saw or somehow were closely involved, somehow have some witness to something they saw that night. We get different perspectives on what happened. And this is where digital game techniques can actually offer something special, because you can show the imperfection of witnesses. So maybe their view is blocked and partially obscured so they can only get some glimpses. Or maybe, as is true for many of the women inside the houses, they're only hearing what happened, but not really seeing it. Or, and this is my favorite idea, someone like Wilkinson is right there on the street, but the player's ability to control the viewing perspective is disabled, right? So in other words, the camera automatically looks away, as it might have done as one was terrified, right? And so then the end of the episode is the character recounting the evidence that he or she gave, or we surmise it. And at the conclusion of the testimony, the player sees a version of the events as described by that character's testimony that's overlaid on the Revere print, right? So we can help remake that print itself. So we're really excited about this game, as you can tell. We're working with public history sites to get it out once it's out, and it's fun to think about. And I have to say, my book was a lot of fun to research and to write. And I don't want to discount the place of fun in what we do, but I think that it's worth it to reflect for just a moment on this project in the time that we are living in, just here in conclusion. Like every historian in the country, I think, I was horrified by that farce of the 1776 project, right? And yet, I mean, of all people, I felt a little bad about that. The Boston Massacre has got to be one of the hoariest of the old chestnuts of the coming of the American Revolution, right? And as you just heard, I don't even think that what happened in Boston in 1770 was much of a protest. And so as I reflected on this, trying to think about what I want to say to you all today, I realized that my act of protest is not actually discovering the protests of the past. My protest lies in those goals that I have for my scholarship. It's how I write about the 18th century. It lies in refusing to let readers, who are my fellow Americans, continue to believe that our national history is as simple and as easy as they've been led to believe. Now, every historian is in the business of complicating the past, and in that way, we're all engaged in common protest. But my book and my computer game together are trying to do everything they can to turn the chestnut of the Boston Massacre into whatever the botanical opposite is of a chestnut. And they can't do that, I think, without recognizing where my audience is starting from. So I think, first of all, of that public history dictum, to meet people where they are. This summer, I don't know if any of you read it, but you should. I just tore through Lonnie Bunch's memoir about opening the National Museum of African-American History and Culture, right? That's called A Fool's Errand. And he has a lot of thoughtful things to say about negotiating history in a political age that I've really taken on. When I speak at historical societies or libraries or bookstores, those audiences start with what they know, which is this old story of 1776, some of which is what President Trump had in mind. That's where many people begin. And likewise, there's no question that computer games are where a lot of people already are. But then, I hope, they start to read the book and notice that I open it with a woman in Ireland, or they start to play the game and realize that barmaids played a crucial role in this iconic event. They see that the Boston Massacre doesn't make sense if you just think of it as a bunch of guys with guns. Most of all, I hope that by shifting their perspective on a picture that many feel they know, readers and players will come to have a better understanding of what we do as historians. We all know that we don't just uncover a static past. The past isn't a bedtime story that you drift off to sleep with. It's a problem that we have to reckon with, and we have to help others understand that it's a problem, not just in our struggle with the sources, but in the relationship to our present moment. And it's hard work, whether we're writing it or reading it or playing it. But even hard work, like a good protest march, can be a lot of fun. So thank you so much for letting me talk. So appreciate it.
Oh, that was terrific. Thank you so much, Serena. There's so much rich material in what you just shared with us, and I can't appreciate it enough. And I do also need to apologize that in my excitement to hear you talk, I neglected to get to the final paragraph, which actually mentions the title of your book, which is, of course, The Boston Massacre, A Family History, and there is a link to that in the chat as well. I'm sure we have a ton of questions that are coming, but if I might sort of jump the queue a little bit and ask the first question, how do you see, and I say this having some really wonderful colleagues at Iona in data science and computer science, and I think some of them are actually here tonight, who work in game development. And something that I've really come to think about in those collaborations is how primary sources are so similar to the data that the data and computer scientists use, right? So I guess if you could just talk a little bit about how the tools and the research methods that you used for A Family History are distinct, overlap with, or both distinct and overlap with the tools that you drew on as a sort of a DH person in Witness to a Revolution. And if I could also just say, the sound of the snow crunching was so striking. That was just such a wonderful detail, really, really extraordinary. So thank you.
Of course. And I think maybe to start with there, and also seeing a little bit other, I'll try not to read the chat also, so I stay focused, and I'll let you all work on that. I did have a student who worked on this project who was fascinated with sound. So we have lots of different sound pieces that are not all in there, and we'll see where they end up. But she loved the snow. So yeah, I would say I did not start as a DH person at all. And when I began this project, and I was just trying to figure out how to create a relational database, I found myself reading these essays from British historians in the 70s, right? The kind of cliometrics that was happening there. They were the people who really taught me how to set up a relational database, which is ridiculous but true, right? And so, I started really from nowhere. I was guided in many ways by people with more experience, which included students, undergraduates. But I'd say that what really mattered really was this question of organization, right? In some ways, that is the true overlap, right? Is that, no matter what you're doing, you're coding, right? To what degree does this piece of evidence help me support this piece? Is it for that piece? I didn't want to say everything I wrote about was zeros and ones, right? In the way that we might have to code digitally. There's a little more gray going on there, but there are ways to figure out how you represent that gray. And we've talked a lot about this with the students digitally also. So I would say in that way, it really is about theme. How do we organize? How do we put these things together? There's a lot of possible data, right? And that's what we worked on.
Great, thank you so much. And also, that also seems extremely relevant in as you speak about audience and connecting with people where they are. I thought your use of merit as someone who deep down really just wants to be sort of a Jane Austen scholar and will masquerade in any way I possibly can, that was a really arresting image, because I think that also really connects. It's a really great organizational as well as narrative connection with Austen's work. So we have our first question, which is a great one from Jessica Linker, who also participated in a session earlier today with Mickey Kaufman about VR. So Jess writes, I love the idea of a branching interactive experience that immerses users into thinking about conflicting accounts of the Boston Massacre. I saw a preview of this at AHA this year. One of your collaborators brought a demo as part of a VR saloon, chaired by Mickey Kaufman, that I also took part in. As someone who has also thought about using VR 3D technology to uncover hidden actors, in my case, women in scientific spaces, emphasizing free exploration and a human interpreter caption system, and has worked collaboratively with students, I am curious how you are thinking about the students who contributed to this project. Also, how are you thinking about how to create the models for this game? My students learned a great deal about archival research and historical interpretation by having to make decisions about incomplete records. And Jess also has thoughts about rendering pipelines, but I'll get to that.
Okay, so we can also, of course, talk offline. And one of the things, of course, that's hardest for me about doing this from Minnesota is without any sense of the room, I don't know really like how deep in the weeds to go. So I'm trusting you, Nora, and you, Michael, to say like, okay, Serena, pull it back.
This is a crowd you can go into the weeds with, I think.
All right, I will go into the weeds. So let's see. There's a couple of pieces there. The piece that that you saw, the 3-minute playthrough, right, is based on this idea of these decision trees, right, that is created through a program called Twine. And there are a number of other ones that we did that are, I think, up through the Museum of the American Revolution, where we talked about that in the spring. And I think they've still linked to some of them on their blog if you're curious. But actually, I started finding that just too rigid. And I think that's the part where people, not only my children, but only my children are frank enough to say that to me, we're like, it's not that interesting to just have a pretty limited set of questions, right? And even though I did play some games with them, Firewatch, a few other things like that, that helped me think about, well, how is it that you could walk through these kind of pipelines and have it still be interesting, especially if it's beautiful enough? We came to realize that really that was too narrow of a way of thinking about games, right? Which is why now we're starting to think about how you could do lots of different mini games, right? So you could have a maze, or we think that for there's going to be some kind of competition thing around cleaning, right? That poor Jane Crothers is going to do, right? Can you collect enough dishes? Can you balance them without breaking them? Those kinds of things, right? A small game, but that is actually kind of amusing as you're trying to figure out these larger pieces. So as you can see, and I'll proselytize for a moment, in these really hard times, I think that thinking about joy matters to us. And so I am really trying to emphasize that in my work, in this game, and everything else, right? That we have to also remember that as humans, we have some capacity for that. So I'm trying to think about what also can be fun, even as we learn. And so that's part of what's going on with the mini games. The student piece, and then I can stop, or I'll let Nora wave at me. Really, we really feel like maybe we've gone as far as we can. And I should name here my collaborator, Austin Mason, who is the digital humanities person at Carleton. And we did, spectacular work with students, as you can see from that game that was almost entirely done with undergraduates. But really, we started to feel like they just don't have, and we have no way of getting them enough art ability to make it look good. And you could see in those games, we played around a little bit with the mouths. For a while, they really looked like vampires, and I was like having nightmares about Jane Crothers. Every time she opened her mouth, it was like too red, and it scared me. But now they have nostril problems, which also scares me a little bit. And, but to fix that is, you'd think it would be easy. You would take, whatever, some, video editing program or some photo editing Photoshop and fix it. But it turns out it's not like that at all. And so as we've been working on trying to make people move, we realized we just need more help, right? So for example, you have figures, you saw those kind of weird naked figures, right? When you clothe figures, it's a completely different coding problem to make clothes move with the figure, right? Or else you have figures who are walking and they're leaving their clothes behind, which is also not the kind of fun we're looking for in this game. So we really needed better computing and art ability. And for that, we reached out to University of Wisconsin Stout, and they're helping us.
That's great. So there really was a lot of institutional or interinstitutional collaboration then.
Yes.
That is something that, right, I think is so integral to digital humanity, is that that we're still playing catch up to in other aspects of the humanities as well. So that's really great to hear that. So our next comment is from Peter Feynman. And Peter writes, "Thank you very much. You have given me a lot to think about for the story in Judges 21, where the Benjamite warriors are the young single British soldiers. The unmarried daughters of Shiloh are looking for husbands and marry the Benjamites. And I hope I am pronouncing that correctly, even though the men are from a different tribe." So more of a comment, I think, than
I think a little more of a comment than a question. But I think in general, I do think it's helpful to remember that, this is not it's not a surprising and unusual situation, right? That, that soldiers come and, have relationships with local young women, right? And there is work everywhere from the biblical stuff that commentator pointed out, to, some fabulous work on, whatever, Korea, right? And everything in between. This thing is not surprising to us. I think what is different, though, is that I don't believe in any way that the kind of intimate relationships that soldiers are having with local women are really political in the way that they are either in that biblical story or in the work of, sorry, I'm gonna lose her name, who wrote about Tense and Tender Ties. Somebody might give that to me. Ann Stoller, right? Who's really helped us see the ways in which colonialism and sex and, and these kind of, official members of the state, which of course is an army is, can go hand in hand. And yet, actually, that's not the story here. And that's what I found particularly interesting, right? Is that both political sides really want to deny any connection between them, right? And that was the part that was unusual that I thought needed explanation.
Nora, do you mind? I have a question, and I feel like overstepping my bounds partially as being the tech moderator, but I just want to say thank you so much for that, Serena. That was amazing, and this question is sort of drawing on my experiences from this conference, but also where I think the field might be going. I think that what I've been learning, not just this weekend, but in the last couple of years of scholarship, is that there's a sense that social history is making a big comeback, and especially social history that is so finely grained and so just so exact and so illuminating as yours, but also combined, of course, with these digital humanities techniques. And my question for you is, and this is very much a speculative question, in your mind, where do you see the conjunction between social history, which I think for a while has been associated with an older generation of historians, and this very new digital humanities technology that we have, which you've combined so well with your collaborators in this video game? Where might it go, do you think, moving forward?
Okay. Oh, now you're just asking me to pontificate, which is embarrassing. But I
that was kind of the point of the question. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'll try. Let's see. I think that the overlap, makes a lot of sense, right? As I was saying, both that social history and the quantitative cliometrics of the 70s, which is when so much of this began, right? I have a colleague here who cleaned out his office a few years ago. We found punch cards, right, from the 70s. All of that work of social history and that initial quantitative history, of course, those two grew together, right? And the quantitative history and those kind of early digital pieces were part of the same story. And I don't think that they ever really died as practices or as methodologies. I think what's changed is their questions, right? I mean, I think it used to be that we would hope with these kind of social histories that if we could know everything about a life and about a place, that we could know the past and fix it, right? And that, I think, is what we don't believe anymore, right? That's really what so much other work since the early 70s has come to show us, right? How partial these archives are, right? The importance of understanding culture as we put, these social questions into them. That politics does shape a big piece of the story of the social. So I don't think it's the same old social history, right? But I do think that the promise of social history, that it would allow us through sources that were not easily accessible, that it would allow us to get at people who don't show up easily in the records, right? That promise still feels somewhat unfulfilled to us. And that's the piece that and I think I'm not alone, are still trying to work with, right? That's the hope of it.
That's wonderfully said. Thank you. Mike, do you have a follow-up? Okay, so now we've got a big one, a big question, another big question coming in from Ben Carp, and this is what Ben says. Okay, I'll try to ask a big one. If there's a theme running, it's just in case you thought there's going to be anything less. If there's a theme running through Dangerous Economies and Boston Massacre, it's, quote, badly behaved men make too much history, end quote. We need that on a t-shirt. What would a history of 18th century America look like, given the available sources, that took women's experiences seriously enough that we would have a more accurate picture of the holistic history of early America?
Yeah. Wow. Thanks, Ben. Can you give me a heads up, a little private note, something? Let me see if I can make sense of what would that history look like. I think that, it would, I think it would pay attention to the power that Ben is pointing to there, right? That what makes it possible for these badly behaved men to make so much history, right? That they can do it. They get to do it, right? And so I don't think that we should lose that piece that that sometimes we miss underneath all of the noise, that that actually there's a reason why men get to make the history, right? That piece of it. But I think we also need to remember that they don't get always the last word. They just think they did, right? I mean, and that's the point of, the juxtaposition in some ways of Revere with Austin, right? Revere thought that he got to say the whole thing, right? He has that picture, there it is sitting on my back, right? We all know it. And he gets to say a lot there, but Austin has something for us to say too, and that's never totally disappeared, right? So I guess I'd say, and Ben, I'm not positive I'm answering your question. You're welcome for a follow-up. That that the challenge is figuring out what is it that men did with that power, right? And what were all of the other ways in which they didn't quite get to do what they thought they wanted to, right? Because that power is never absolute, that I believe, right? Like there, I'm enough of a Foucauldian to say nobody really gets to hold it all the time, right? It's always leaking out in various places. And that's part of, I think, what the question is as we look at gender history. It doesn't, I think, really open up sufficiently the questions that we should also be attending to, especially around slavery, but more generally around race, right? In which absolutely it's not only men who have the power, right? And so I wouldn't want to say it's strictly bifurcated in those ways, but I think that approach of thinking about what is it that they didn't quite get to do might help us a little bit.
Thank you. Yeah, that seems a very good answer. Ben, do you have a follow-up? I can either unmute you if you would like, or I see the Q&A is popping. Yes, he does. So men's power is contingent, in other words. I like that. I wasn't trying to stump you with a question, only going where I think you've led us. Anyway, this follow-up is just the equivalent of gives approving nod.
Thank you.
Well said, Ben. So I should also add that Jess Linker has kindly followed up in the chats as well with that you should talk further, and that she has some renderings that her students made in Unity that she's happy to share and to workshop with. So we have about 5-10 minutes left, and I know this has been a long day for you, but do we have any other? Oh wait, did I speak too soon? No, okay. Do you have any other questions from the audience? Again, I can unmute anybody. Feel free to add them to the chat or to the Q&A. Michael or Trisha, do you have any Jess has a lot of arcane Unity related questions for you, if you would like those.
That maybe doesn't need the entire webinar.
Or I will put you, if you don't already email each other, I can put you in email touch. Probably not. Smiley face.
Maybe it would be worth it for people to know that I actually have gotten this far without really learning Unity. And, I'm okay with it.
And Jess thinks that's okay too! Exclamation point. Really got to emphasize punctuation in my role of overseeing the Q&A and chat. Well, if there are no other questions from the audience, I think I spoke too soon. Oh yes, there is. Don Johnson asks, have you found much of a difference between the relationships between soldiers and inhabitants in Boston and those in other outposts of empire like Ireland, India, Gibraltar, etc.?
That is a fabulous question, and I've only looked at some of those places and not all. So I would say that a lot of it does depend on the sort of, to go back to our 70s question about social history, a lot of it depends on the demography, right? So one reason for the large number of marriages in Boston is because the sex ratio is so unbalanced after the 7 Years' War. But, certainly places where soldiers are for a long period, they do marry. The same is true in Ireland and in England, right? Those pieces are all true. Gibraltar actually has a much smaller resident population like Nova Scotia. I mean, so the 29th Regiment is in Nova Scotia, much longer than it's in Boston, right? It's there for over 3 years as opposed to just a couple of years, ends up in Boston. And there's actually only, I think, I have to double check, but something like 6 or 7 marriages, right? There's just not that many women. It's just a smaller place. They're sent out the soldiers are split up and sent out to different places. I don't know what India is like. I'm going to suspect, though, that it's fairly similar. I mean, not the low number of people, right? It's a densely populated place, but that also that the soldiers are split up into lots of different towns and areas and garrisons. But the piece that I think, at least in the pre-1763 world, a lot changes after that. The piece that I think is most helpful to remember is that they're very rarely living in those garrisons, in those barracks, right? And if they are, they're not closed off places. So those relationships are equally, I would say, back and forth, right? So when troops are used as police, the people who are being policed are not happy about it, right? That's sort of no surprise. That's what, so in Ireland, there's a revolt called the Hearts of Oak. 29th Regiment, a piece of it is involved in trying to put that down. They're not happy about it at all, right? There's these Irish protesters, unsurprisingly. But other parts of Ireland are perfectly happy to have them, find them completely unexceptional, find them an excellent, source of commerce, and are pretty unhappy when they leave, as is true in some of these other areas also. So I'd say there's nothing particular going on in Boston, except maybe this real demographic shift.
Thank you so much. And we just have one final comment from Peter Feynman, who said that he forgot to mention the captured Hessians who intermarried with the Pennsylvania Palatines. It's like Star Wars and Roman history, just kind of get into your head and pronunciations and settle here. So I don't know if you have any response to that, or just to add to it.
No, I mean, that's work that actually I think Don could probably speak to better than I. We would otherwise open it up, but that is no, but I think only to remind us that marriages are both political and personal, and we have to remember to take them both, as continues to be true in our lives now.
It's very relevant, and in many respects, I think a very perfect note to wrap up on. If there are no, every time I go to say that, then I see the little Q&A, but nope, Serena, just when you thought. And this I will say will be our final question. So thank you. Mark Boonshoff says he loved the presentation. And can you talk for a second about selling a book that perhaps makes a familiar event less significant? Oh, I see. I mean that in the best sense. The way you narrate this is very different than books that are framed as the thing that started everything important and led to war and blah, blah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I could write that book, right? I think you've all just heard me say that. Like, I'm just not the person who's going to say, this is a great thing because it just led to a war. Somehow my heart wouldn't be in it. I think that I think what really mattered to me as I wrote the book was to ensure that these people that we've never heard of before, that we never thought about, like Jane Chambers, this Irish woman, or some of these other people, actually had a minute to be a part of this story. And once I made them central, they had to carry the book somehow. And I had to figure out a way that I could tell a story that I hoped people would want to read, right? That was just familiar enough that they could pick up the book, But that really ended up not bringing them to the place that they thought they would. And in that way, and here Ben was maybe too kind to make the connection, it's not so unlike my New York book, which is really also about an event that people might have thought was important, but in which I say actually it means nothing at all. And it's, you know, hard to continue to write these books that say, you know, you should invest in 3 hours of your life in reading something that I'm going to tell you is unimportant. But the hope is that the journey is what matters, right? Not that we've gotten somewhere, but that as we make our way through the 18th century, we come to see something else.
And that truly is a perfect note on which to conclude not over this incredible keynote, but our conference as a whole. So thank you so very much, Serena. This was just a phenomenal talk. I wish right now I was about to say, and now let's go to a reception in your honor and have some wine and snacks. But until we are able to belatedly